Welcome to Business Reporter's The Future of Responsible Business campaign. I'm Rachel Hicks. As sustainability has moved to the top of the global agenda, environmental, social and corporate governance, ESG, has become one of the hottest topics in business. That's because a company's ability to raise funds increasingly depends upon its ESG performance. But in a world of complex supply chains, measuring and reporting ESG performance can be arduous and costly. How can organisations stay on top of their ESG commitments and make sure they run their businesses sustainably? Good morning, Lauren.
Morning, Rachel.
So what do we mean by ESG exactly?
Good question. There are so many acronyms in the ESG world. So ESG simply stands for environmental, social and governance issues. So these were issues that were traditionally thought to be non-financial and therefore not part of investment decision making, but increasingly have been recognized to have financial implications, even though they may not be found in traditional financial reporting.
So why does ESG matter?
So we've recognised over the last decade or so that actually just because environmental, social and governance issues don't appear in traditional financial statements, that they do actually have financial implications. So if we think about climate change, for example, there will be significant costs for businesses and for investors associated with climate-related risks. Similarly, we know that obviously governance has an enormous implications when it comes to the financial viability of a company. And similarly, it's increasingly recognized that social issues do too. If you have supply chain corruption, if you've got child labor in your supply chain, if you've got a workforce that's unhappy even, these can all have very significant implications when it comes to your viability as a business.
How challenging is it for companies to measure and manage ESG?
I think what we've found is that as ESG has evolved as a field, there are more and more pieces of information being asked of companies by investors. And that can pose challenges. We certainly see in company reporting that there are biases towards those companies that are very large, that the largest companies tend to have the best ESG reporting. And that's probably a function of the fact that they've got bigger teams and can spend more time and resources on disclosure. We have also seen regulatory drivers to try and make it simpler for businesses. So, for example, SFDR is a piece of regulation in Europe that's trying to distill down what are the key pieces of ESG information that a company should be reporting and how, so they can disclose in a way that's consistent and comparable on the most important, the most material ESG issues.
So how well does the average FTSE 100 or S&P 500 company score on ESG?
It's a good question because there have been a number of studies that have looked at ESG scores for companies in the key benchmarks. And what they have found is that there's not always consistency in the ESG scores of different providers. I think really what it comes down to, though, is seeing ESG as a process, not as a specific outcome, because the outcomes you might seek might be different for different investors. So, for example, some investors might care more about making sure that they've got no downside risk. So they might want to eliminate from a company, from a portfolio, companies that are particularly bad on certain key issues. Other companies might be seeking to have companies in the portfolio that are exclusively having a positive impact in the world. And the sorts of information you might look at for that type of portfolio would be different. You might be looking at what the products and services of the companies does, whereas the one that's looking at the downside risk might be looking at issues related to a big carbon footprint. And in reality, you can have companies that might have a very big carbon footprint that make products and services that are very good in the world, such as electric vehicle companies. It's not really about one ESG score that will tell you what is right and wrong. It's about all the different data points that you might need in order to answer the specific ESG question that you have.
So how does S&P Global help?
One of the key ways in which we help is by bringing all of these different data points together. We have collected that information for all of these different data points for thousands and thousands of companies globally and brought all of that information together. So that can come from company disclosed data through our survey. We've done a survey process for 20 years where companies disclose lots of environmental, social and governance pieces of information. We also have a huge collection of climate-related data, both from disclosures from companies as well as models that enable us to calculate potential risks in the absence of disclosures. And we bring all of this information together so that companies can look at that and understand how they're performing, and investors can use that in large investment portfolios.
Why do companies need you? Isn't this something that they could do themselves?
Yeah, and it's important that they're doing this themselves. They need to be looking at environmental, social, governance issues and in their businesses, and they need to be reporting it. The area where we come in most help, I think, is in helping to compare companies with one another. So we've got databases that enable you to look at the whole of your supply chain, which I think is extremely important and would be very difficult for a company to collect all that information. Similarly, if you're an investor and you've got a large investment portfolio, you need a broad range of different data points on lots and lots of different companies. So I think what we're really doing that really helps is taking a lot of the legwork out of collecting that data, making sure it's standardized, making sure it's good quality, and enabling companies to take a more holistic and broader view of their entire business or investment portfolio.
So how do you make sure that your data is accurate?
So one of the key ways is that we have models that enable us to compare with disclosed information. So one of the biggest errors when companies start reporting on carbon emissions is they get the metric wrong. They don't necessarily know whether 10 tons of carbon or 10 million tons of carbon is a sensible number. The metric being wrong is a really common one, which we can very easily capture if we're comparing a disclosure with what a model estimate would be. And then we also make sure that we've got data verification processes in place so we can work with companies to help them in terms of their reporting and to support them in their disclosures so that it reduces the chances of errors in the corporate reporting.
How do you think ESG and companies' performance is going to evolve in the next, say, 10 years?
I think we're going to see ESG disclosure and reporting by companies become completely standard. We might see it in the same place as the financial reporting is. And also I think we're going to see ESG integration into business practices and into investment processes, again, as being completely standard. So I think what's very clear is that as ESG disclosures improve, we'll also see ESG practices improve, and also we should see an improvement in ESG performance across companies as well.